Story 1. The Endless Mile Marker. Thomas Brennan had been hauling freight across the continental United States for 23 years, and in that time he'd learned to trust his instincts more than his GPS. On the night of September 14th, 2022, those instincts started screaming at him somewhere along Interstate 40 in the Oklahoma Panhandle, but by then it was already too late to turn back. The load was routine enough, 40,000 pounds of industrial equipment headed from Amarillo to Oklahoma City, with a delivery window that gave him plenty of cushion time. Thomas had taken this route dozens of times before, knew every truck stop and rest area by heart. The weather was clear, traffic was light, and his 2019 Kenworth was running smooth as silk. Everything should have been perfect. But as he passed mile marker 73 for what he thought was the first time that night, something felt wrong. He couldn't put his finger on it initially, just a creeping sensation at the base of his skull, like being watched. Thomas adjusted his mirror, checked his blind spots, but saw nothing except empty highway stretching behind him into darkness. The digital clock on his dash read 11:47 p.m. He'd been on the road for 6 hours, right on schedule. His CB radio crackled with occasional chatter from other drivers, normal traffic reports and weather updates. Everything was normal. Everything except that feeling. Thomas reached for his thermos of coffee, took a long sip, and focused on the white lines disappearing beneath his hood. The headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness, illuminating the reflective mile markers as they flickered past. 74, 75, 76. He settled into the rhythm of the road, letting his mind wander to his daughter's upcoming wedding in November. He was supposed to give her away, walk her down the aisle. He'd already taken the time off, had his suit cleaned and pressed. Mile marker 77 appeared in his headlights, then vanished behind him, then 78. The numbers were counting up normally, exactly as they should. Thomas glanced at his GPS, which showed him moving steadily east along I-40, his little blue dot crawling across the digital map at exactly 65 miles per hour. He checked his mirrors again, more out of habit than concern. That's when he saw the mile marker, 73. Thomas blinked, certain he'd misread it. He'd just passed 78, hadn't he? He stared at his odometer, watched it tick over another tenth of a mile. The next marker should be 79. His heartbeat quickened as it came into view, white and reflective in his headlights. 73. What the hell? Thomas muttered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. He checked his GPS again. According to the device, he was exactly where he should be, moving forward at a steady pace. But the mile markers were telling a different story. He passed another one, 73, and another, 73. Every single marker, all identical, all reading 73. Thomas grabbed his CB radio, pressed the transmit button. "Breaker, breaker, this is Midnight Runner. Anybody copy?" His voice sounded strained even to his own ears. The radio crackled with static, but no response came. "This is Midnight Runner on I-40 eastbound. Anybody out there?" Nothing. Just that soft, persistent static that seemed to pulse with a rhythm all its own. He drove for another 5 minutes, and every mile marker read 73. His GPS insisted he was making progress, showed him moving forward, but those markers kept coming, one after another, all the same. Thomas felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. He'd heard stories from other drivers over the years, tales told at truck stops and rest areas. Stories about highways that didn't make sense, roads that went nowhere, stretches of asphalt where the normal rules didn't apply. He'd always laughed them off as bullshit, the kind of legends that grow when men spend too much time alone in the dark. But this was real. This was happening to him right now, and he couldn't explain it. Thomas tried his cell phone, thinking maybe he could call dispatch, but the screen showed no signal. That wasn't unusual out here in the middle of nowhere, but combined with everything else, it made his chest tighten with anxiety. He kept driving because what else could he do? Stopping didn't seem like a smart option, not when he didn't understand what was happening. At least while he was moving, he felt like he had some control. The highway remained empty. No other vehicles appeared in either direction, which struck Thomas as odd even for this time of night. He should have seen at least a few other trucks, maybe some passenger vehicles. But the road stretched out before and behind him in perfect, unbroken isolation. Just him, his rig, and those impossible mile markers. Mile marker 73, again and again and again. Thomas checked his fuel gauge, 3/4 of a tank. His GPS still showed forward progress, the blue dot creeping along. His odometer was clicking over normally, but those markers refused to change. Time became elastic and strange. Thomas looked at his clock and saw that only 3 minutes had passed since he'd first noticed the anomaly, but it felt like he'd been driving for hours. His coffee had gone cold in its thermos, which didn't make sense because it had been piping hot when he'd poured it at his last stop. Then he noticed the trees. The Oklahoma Panhandle wasn't known for dense forestation, mostly scrubland and prairie grass, but the vegetation along the highway was wrong. The trees that lined the road were tall and gnarled, their branches reaching toward the highway like twisted fingers. Thomas didn't remember any trees like that, and he'd driven this stretch countless times. They swayed in a wind he couldn't feel, their movements synchronized in a way that made his skin crawl. Mile marker 73 emerged from the darkness ahead, and this time Thomas noticed something different about it. There was a stain on the white reflective surface, dark and organic looking. As he passed it, he could have sworn the stain looked like a handprint, fingers stretched wide as if someone had reached out desperately. His heart hammered in his chest as the next marker appeared. It had the same stain, the same handprint. They all did, he realized. Every single marker 73 bore that dark, desperate handprint. "Okay, Thomas, think," he said aloud, his voice sounding too loud in the cab. "There's got to be a rational explanation. GPS malfunction? No, that doesn't explain the markers. Identical markers, maybe some kind of construction error?" But even as he said it, he knew it was nonsense. You don't accidentally place dozens of identical mile markers on an interstate highway. The CB radio suddenly erupted with sound, making Thomas jump. But it wasn't the normal chatter of truck drivers. It was music, old and scratchy, like it was being played on a damaged record. He didn't recognize the tune, something slow and mournful, with vocals in a language he couldn't identify. The music distorted and warped, the pitch sliding up and down sickeningly. Thomas reached to switch it off, but his hand froze halfway to the dial. A voice cut through the music, clear and cold. "Turn around, Thomas Brennan." It knew his name. The thing on the radio knew his name. "Turn around while you still can." Thomas's mouth went dry. His hands were shaking on the steering wheel. "Who is this?" he demanded, but the only response was that awful music, louder now, filling the cab with its distorted melody. He switched off the CB, plunging the cab into silence, broken only by the rumble of the engine and the whisper of tires on asphalt. Mile marker 73. The handprint seemed darker now, more defined. Thomas could make out individual finger marks, the desperate spread of a palm pressed against the reflective surface. He thought about the voice on the radio, its command to turn around. But turn around to what? Behind him was the same endless highway, the same impossible markers. There was no guarantee that going backward would be any different than going forward. His fuel gauge had dropped to half a tank, which didn't make sense. He shouldn't have burned through that much fuel, not in the time that had passed according to his clock. But when Thomas looked at the clock, he saw something that made his blood run cold. It read 11:47 p.m. the same time it had been when he'd first noticed the mile markers. The digital numbers flickered, reset, read 11:47 p.m. again. Time wasn't passing, or it was passing and resetting over and over. Thomas felt panic rising in his throat like bile. He pressed harder on the accelerator, watching his speedometer climb to 70, then 75. The mile markers came faster, but they were all the same. 73, 73, 73. Each one with that handprint, that marker of someone else's desperation. The trees along the highway were moving now, actually moving, their trunks sliding closer to the road. Thomas watched in horror as the forest tightened around him, the branches reaching lower, scraping against the top of his trailer with metallic shrieks. He couldn't slow down, couldn't stop, because he was certain that if he did, those branches would tear through the cab. Those trees would crush him and his rig into the highway itself. Mile marker 73 rushed past, and in the split second of its appearance, Thomas saw something that made him cry out. There was a figure standing next to the marker, illuminated briefly by his headlights. It was a man, or had been a man, wearing trucker's clothing from another era, maybe the 70s or 80s. His face was twisted in terror, his mouth open in a silent scream, and his hand was pressed against the mile marker, creating that desperate handprint. As Thomas's truck rocketed past, the figure turned to watch him, and Thomas saw that the man's eyes were empty sockets, dark and endless. The next marker appeared, and there was another figure. A woman this time, also dressed in outdated clothing, also with that expression of absolute horror, also pressing her hand to the marker. And the next one, another figure, and the next. Each mile marker 73 was accompanied by a ghost, a victim, a driver who had become trapped in this impossible loop. Thomas was screaming now, he realized, a raw sound that tore from his throat. He couldn't stop, couldn't slow down. The fuel gauge read a quarter tank. His clock still read 11:47 p.m. The mile markers kept coming, each with its ghost, its witness to the impossibility of this place. How many times had he passed this point? How many loops had he completed? There was no way to know. Then ahead in the distance, Thomas saw something different. Not a mile marker, but a light. A golden, warm light that seemed to promise escape, sanctuary, normalcy. Without thinking, he aimed his truck toward it, pressing the accelerator all the way down. The speedometer climbed past 80, past 90. The trees were a blur now, the ghosts streaking past like frames of a film played too fast. The light grew closer, and Thomas could see it was a gap in the trees, an opening that led somewhere else. He focused on it with every fiber of his being, willing his truck to reach it before his fuel ran out, before whatever controlled this place decided he'd become another ghost standing beside mile marker 73. With a sensation like breaking through a membrane, Thomas's truck burst through the light and back onto normal highway. The trees vanished. The odd darkness lifted slightly, and most importantly, the mile marker that rushed past his headlights read 79. Thomas eased off the accelerator, his whole body shaking. He pulled onto the shoulder, engaged his hazard lights, and sat there for a long moment, trying to convince himself that he was really out. His CB radio crackled back to life with normal traffic, drivers chatting about weather and road conditions. His cell phone showed signal again, and his clock finally moved, ticking over to 11:53 p.m. He'd lost 6 minutes, or gained them back. Thomas wasn't sure which. He made his delivery on time, said nothing to anyone about what had happened. What could he say that wouldn't make him sound insane? But Thomas Brennan never took that stretch of I-40 again. He added hours to his routes, burned extra fuel, took secondary roads that wound through small towns, and added time to his schedule. And sometimes, late at night, he still heard that music from his CB radio, that scratchy, mournful tune that made him think of all those ghosts trapped at mile marker 73. pressing their hands to that reflective surface, desperate for someone to see them, to witness their impossible fate. Thomas had witnessed it, and he knew with absolute certainty that he'd barely escaped becoming one of them. The worst part was knowing they were still there, still trapped in that loop, still pressing their hands to that marker. And somewhere out there, another driver was approaching mile marker 73 for the first time, about to learn that not all roads lead home. Story 2. The Phantom Convoy. Margaret Holloway had spent 17 years hauling refrigerated goods across the northern states, and she prided herself on maintaining her reefer unit better than anyone else in her company. On the night of March 3, 2023, she was running a load of frozen foods from Minnesota to Michigan, following Highway 2 through the Upper Peninsula in weather that had turned from clear to threatening in less than an hour. The snow started just after midnight, light flurries that Margaret barely noticed. She'd driven through worse, much worse, and her rig was equipped for winter conditions. The load was time-sensitive, had to reach the distribution center in Marquette by 6 a.m., which gave her a comfortable window. The highway was mostly empty at this hour, just the occasional set of headlights passing in the opposite direction. Margaret had her CB on, listening to the sparse chatter of the few other drivers braving the weather. At 12:30 a.m., she noticed the headlights behind her. A semi keeping pace about a quarter-mile back, maintaining that distance consistently. Margaret thought nothing of it initially. Plenty of drivers preferred to follow someone else in bad weather, using the leader's taillights as a guide. But as the minutes ticked by and the snow intensified, she realized the truck behind her was matching her speed exactly, maintaining that precise distance no matter how she adjusted her pace. She slowed down to 55. The truck behind her slowed. She sped up to 65. The truck sped up. Always that same distance, always those same headlights in her mirror. Margaret keyed her CB. "Hey there, driver behind me on Highway 2 eastbound, you got your ears on?" Static answered her. "Driver in my mirror, this is Ice Queen, you copy?" Nothing but the soft hiss of the radio. Margaret felt the first twinge of unease. She adjusted her mirrors, trying to get a better look at the truck following her, but the snow was too heavy now, reducing the headlights to diffuse glows in the darkness. She couldn't make out what kind of rig it was, couldn't see any identifying features. Just those lights, constant and unwavering. Then she saw the second truck. It appeared off to her right, emerging from a side road that Margaret didn't remember being there. The truck swung onto Highway 2 smoothly, positioning itself perfectly parallel to her rig. Not behind, not ahead, but exactly beside her, matching her speed. Margaret's heart rate kicked up a notch. She tried to look over at the other truck, but visibility was too poor. All she could see was its vague shape and its lights. "Okay, this is getting weird," Margaret muttered. She reached for her CB again, but before she could key the mic, a third truck appeared. This one materialized from a side road on her left, pulling alongside her with the same eerie precision. 3 trucks now, one behind and one on each side, all maintaining perfect formation, all matching her speed exactly. Margaret felt her hands tighten on the steering wheel. This wasn't normal convoy behavior. Drivers sometimes grouped up for safety in bad weather, sure, but not like this. Not with this kind of precision, this kind of coordination. And the fact that none of them were responding to her radio calls made everything worse. She tried her cell phone, thinking maybe she'd call dispatch, but the screen showed no signal. Not unusual in this remote area, especially in a snowstorm, but it added to her growing anxiety. The snow was getting heavier, the wind picking up, and Margaret had to focus more on keeping her truck on the road. But those other trucks stayed with her, maintaining their formation like fighter jets in flight. Then the 4th truck appeared, pulling ahead of her and settling into position about a quarter mile in front. 4 trucks now, surrounding her in a perfect diamond formation. Margaret's breathing quickened. She tried to convince herself there was a rational explanation, that this was some kind of coordinated convoy she'd accidentally joined, but her instincts were screaming that something was very, very wrong. The trucks all had their running lights on, she realized, but the patterns were strange. The lights seemed to pulse in rhythm, all 4 trucks synchronized, creating a hypnotic effect in the snowy darkness. Margaret forced herself to look away, focusing on the road, but she could still see the pulsing in her peripheral vision. "This is Ice Queen calling any driver. I'm on Highway 2 eastbound and I need assistance," Margaret said into her CB, hearing the edge of panic in her voice. "I've got 4 trucks in formation around me and they're not responding. Anybody copy?" The static that answered seemed somehow mocking, and buried within it, Margaret thought she heard something like whispers, multiple voices speaking in unison. But the words were incomprehensible. She tried to break formation, slowing down significantly, hoping the other trucks would pass her by. But they all slowed with her, maintaining their positions with impossible accuracy. She sped up, pushing her rig faster than was safe in these conditions, and they matched her again. It was like they were all connected, all controlled by the same mind, all moving as one unit with Margaret trapped in the center. The truck in front of her, the one leading the formation, began to change. Margaret blinked, certain the snow was playing tricks on her eyes, but no. The truck was definitely different. It looked older now, its shape more angular, like something from the 70s or 80s. The lights were different too, older style, and the whole rig seemed to flicker, becoming translucent for a moment before solidifying again. Margaret glanced at the truck on her right. It was also changing, also aging, its modern lines giving way to a more dated design. She looked left, saw the same thing happening. The truck behind her, visible in her mirror, was transforming as well. All 4 trucks were becoming older, shifting back through time even as they maintained their positions around her. "What the hell is this?" Margaret whispered, her voice cracking. The pulsing lights intensified, and now she could see through the snow into the cabs of the other trucks. There were figures inside, drivers sitting at their wheels, but they were wrong. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, like puppets being operated by invisible strings. Their heads turned in perfect unison to look at Margaret, and even through the distance and the snow she could see that their faces were blank, features smoothed away to nothing. The highway beneath her tires felt different now, rougher, and Margaret realized with horror that it was changing too. The modern asphalt was becoming older pavement, cracked and weathered. The snow seemed to be falling upward as much as down, defying gravity, creating disorienting patterns in her headlights. Time itself felt unstable, stretching and compressing unpredictably. Margaret's GPS unit had gone haywire, the screen displaying impossible coordinates, the map showing roads that couldn't exist. Her speed seemed both too fast and too slow simultaneously, her engine roaring and purring at the same time. The logical part of her brain knew this was impossible, that reality didn't work this way. But the evidence of her senses was undeniable. The truck in front of her began to slow, and the entire formation slowed with it. Margaret had no choice but to match their speed, dropping from 60 to 50 to 40 to 30. They were barely crawling now, moving through the snow at a pace that felt almost ceremonial. The pulsing lights had synchronized with Margaret's heartbeat, she realized. Or maybe her heartbeat had synchronized with the lights. Either way, the rhythm dominated her awareness, making it hard to think, hard to focus on anything except those lights and the faceless drivers surrounding her. Then the trucks began to close in. The formation tightened, the trucks moving closer and closer to Margaret's rig. She laid on her horn, a long blast that sounded muffled and wrong in the snow-filled air. The other trucks didn't respond, just kept pressing inward. Margaret could see the details of their weathered sides now, could read the faded company names that didn't exist anymore, could see the rust and damage that spoke of years on the road. She realized with a jolt of terror that these weren't real trucks. They couldn't be. These were ghosts, echoes of vehicles that had traveled this highway decades ago, and somehow they'd found her, trapped her, pulled her into their eternal convoy. The faceless drivers weren't people anymore, just impressions left behind, the psychic residue of men and women who had driven until they became part of the road itself. The trucks were close enough now that Margaret could reach out and touch them if she opened her window. Their sides scraped against hers with sounds like screaming metal, but when she looked, there were no marks, no damage. They were passing through her truck like it was made of smoke, and she felt cold seep into the cab, a cold that had nothing to do with the winter weather outside. Margaret did the only thing she could think of. She slammed on her brakes, bringing her rig to a complete stop right there in the middle of the highway. The phantom trucks continued forward for a moment, breaking formation, and Margaret felt a surge of hope. But then they stopped too, all four of them, and began backing up, moving in reverse with the same mechanical precision they'd displayed all along. They reformed their diamond around Margaret's stopped truck, and now they were completely still. Engines idling in harmony, creating a deep thrumming that Margaret felt in her bones. The pulsing lights had stopped, and in the sudden stillness she could hear something. It was coming from her CB radio, a sound she'd heard before but couldn't quite place. It took her a moment to realize it was the sound of highway driving, the whoosh of wind and tires on pavement, the rumble of engines. But it was wrong somehow, distorted like a recording played backward. The faceless drivers all turned to look at her again, moving as one. They raised their hands, pointing at Margaret, and she saw that their fingers were elongated, too long, ending in points. The gesture was accusatory, condemning, and Margaret felt a wave of emotion that didn't belong to her. Guilt, regret, loneliness, the crushing weight of endless miles and endless nights, the slow dissolution of self that came from spending too much time on the road, alone with only the highway for company. These drivers, she understood, had given themselves completely to the road. They'd driven until there was nothing left of who they'd been, until they'd become part of the highway itself, ghosts in the machine, doomed to travel forever. And now, they wanted her to join them, to become another member of their phantom convoy, to drive for eternity through the snow and darkness. "No," Margaret said firmly, though her voice shook. "No, I'm not like you. I'm going home. I have a husband waiting for me, kids who need me. I'm not giving myself to the road." She reached for her ignition, ready to start her truck moving again, ready to crash through this formation if she had to, when one of the phantom trucks flickered and disappeared. Then another vanished, and another. Within seconds, all four trucks had faded away, leaving Margaret alone on the highway. The snow lessened, the wind died down, and the road beneath her tires was modern asphalt again. Her GPS flickered back to life, showing her exact position on Highway 2. Her CB radio returned to normal static. Even her cell phone showed signal again. Margaret sat there for a long time, engine idling, trying to process what had happened. Finally, she put her truck in gear and continued toward Marquette. She made her delivery on time, unloaded her cargo, and filed her standard reports. She didn't mention the phantom convoy, didn't tell anyone about the faceless drivers or the trucks that shouldn't exist. But Margaret Holloway changed her life after that night. She put in her notice 2 weeks later, took an office job with the same company, something that kept her close to home. She sold her rig, bought a sensible sedan, and made sure she was home for dinner every single night, because she'd learned something important on Highway 2 that snowy March evening. The road was hungry, always hungry, and it fed on the people who loved it too much. Those drivers who let the highway become their whole life, who sacrificed everything for one more mile, one more load, one more run. They were the ones who never really left. They became part of the road, absorbed into the pavement and the white lines, doomed to drive forever in their phantom convoy. Margaret had almost joined them, had felt the pull of that existence, the seductive promise of becoming one with the endless highway. But she'd said no, and the road had let her go. Sometimes late at night, Margaret still heard that sound from her CB radio, the distorted whoosh of eternal driving. And sometimes she wondered about the drivers who hadn't been strong enough to refuse, the ones who were still out there, forming their diamond formations around lonely truckers, trying to recruit new members for their never-ending convoy. She hoped they found peace eventually, those lost souls. But she suspected they were too far gone, too deeply merged with the highway to ever find their way back. Story 3. The Way Station. Curtis Dalton had been driving professionally for 19 years, and he'd been through every way station from Maine to California more times than he could count. On June 16, 2022, he pulled into what looked like a standard way station on Interstate 15 in Nevada, and he didn't pull out again for what felt like days, though his clock insisted only an hour had passed. The sun was setting as Curtis approached the station, his load of electronics destined for Los Angeles running right on schedule. The large green sign commanded him to pull in, all commercial vehicles, and Curtis complied without hesitation. He'd been driving for 11 hours, and a quick bathroom break sounded good anyway. The station appeared normal from a distance, a low building beside the highway with the familiar scale setup and inspection area. But as Curtis rolled onto the scale, he noticed something off. The building looked newer than he remembered, the paint too fresh, the equipment too modern. He'd been through this particular station maybe a dozen times over the years, and it had always been a bit run down, showing its age. Now it looked like it had been built yesterday. Curtis shrugged it off, figuring they'd done renovations, and waited for the signal to proceed. The light stayed red. Curtis waited, engine idling, watching the building. Nobody emerged. No inspection officer, no weighmaster, nobody at all. The windows of the building were dark, despite the office lights that should have been on. Curtis keyed his CB, trying to raise someone, but got no response. He considered just driving through, but the thought of the fines and penalties that could result from skipping an active way station made him hesitate. After 5 minutes, Curtis shut off his engine and climbed down from his cab, stretching his back and deciding to walk into the office and figure out what was going on. The evening air was hot and dry, typical Nevada desert, and his boots crunched on the fresh asphalt as he approached the building. The front door was propped open, which struck him as odd given the heat, but Curtis pushed through anyway. "Hello? Anybody here?" His voice echoed in the empty lobby. The interior was spotless, everything new and clean, computers humming on desks, lights on, but no people. Curtis walked further in, past the counter where drivers normally checked in, into the back offices. Empty. Every room, every desk, every space completely devoid of human presence. Coffee cups sat on desks with steam, still rising from them as if the occupants had just stepped away moments ago. A radio played softly somewhere, classic country music, the volume low. Curtis felt unease creeping up his spine. This wasn't right. Way stations didn't just empty out like this, especially not with trucks waiting outside. He pulled out his cell phone to call his dispatcher, but the phone showed no signal despite having full bars when he'd pulled in. The display flickered, the bars jumping from 5 to 0 to 3 to 1, never stable. He walked back outside, intending to just leave and deal with any consequences later, but Curtis stopped dead when he saw the parking area. There were more trucks now. At least a dozen semis parked in neat rows, all silent, all dark. They hadn't been there when he'd pulled in, Curtis was certain of that. The lot had been empty. Now it was full of rigs from different eras, different decades even. He could see an old Peterbilt from the 80s, a Kenworth that looked like it was from the 70s, even what appeared to be a 50s-era Mack. "What the hell?" Curtis muttered, walking toward the nearest truck, a relatively modern freightliner. He cupped his hands around his eyes and peered through the driver's side window. The cab was empty, but there was a wallet sitting on the passenger seat, a thermos in the cup holder, a jacket hanging from the hook. All the signs that a driver had been here recently just stepped away for a moment. Curtis tried the door. Unlocked. He climbed up and grabbed the wallet, flipped it open, and felt his blood run cold. The driver's license inside showed a man named Robert Patterson, with an expiration date of 1998. Curtis stared at the faded photo, the outdated license format, and tried to make sense of it. This license was 24 years expired. Nobody would be driving with this. He jumped down from the cab and checked the next truck, then the next. Everyone had personal items inside, wallets and licenses and logbooks, but all the dates were wrong. Some were decades old, the licenses so expired they might as well have been historical artifacts. The logbook showed final entries from years past, the last lines written in the parking lot of this very way station. Curtis's heart was hammering now. He looked around the lot, really looked, and saw that every truck showed signs of age despite having appeared suddenly. Dust covered their hoods, tires were slightly deflated, birds had nested in some of the grills. These trucks had been sitting here for years, maybe decades, but Curtis knew they hadn't been here when he'd arrived. The lot had been empty. He would have noticed a dozen parked semis. Unless they'd been invisible. Unless they'd always been here and only now could he see them. Curtis ran back to his own truck, climbed into the cab and turned the key. The engine turned over but wouldn't start. He tried again, pumping the accelerator, but the Volvo that had been running perfectly just refused to catch. Curtis felt panic rising in his throat. He was trapped here, just like all these other drivers. The way station had caught him, and now he was part of its collection. He tried the CB radio, cycling through channels, hearing nothing but static except on channel 19 where he caught a fragment of conversation. "Been here 2 days now. Won't let me leave." The voice was desperate, male, cutting in and out. Curtis grabbed the mic. "This is Curtis Dalton. I'm trapped at a way station on I-15. Does anybody copy?" The static swelled, and for a moment Curtis thought he heard dozens of voices answering at once, all talking over each other, all saying the same thing. "We're here too. We're all here. Can't leave. Can't ever leave." Curtis dropped the mic like it had burned him. He grabbed his phone again, but it was completely dead now. Wouldn't even turn on. The sun had set while he'd been exploring, and darkness covered the way station. But there were lights now. Lights in the building windows that cast a sickly yellow glow across the parking lot. Curtis could see figures moving inside, shadows that didn't match human proportions, that moved in ways that made his eyes hurt to follow. The other trucks started up, all at once, their engines roaring to life in perfect synchronization. Curtis watched in horror as their headlights switched on, illuminating the lot in harsh white light. The trucks began to move, slowly repositioning themselves, forming a circle around Curtis's rig. Their movements were smooth but wrong, like they were being operated remotely or by something that understood driving but wasn't quite human. Curtis tried his engine again. Nothing. He was surrounded now, the other trucks idling in their circle, their exhaust creating a haze in the still air. The building's front door opened, and something emerged. Curtis couldn't quite focus on it, couldn't quite see what it was, but it wore the shape of a way station officer like an ill-fitting suit. The thing walked toward his truck with jerky mechanical steps, carrying what looked like a clipboard. It reached Curtis's door and looked up at him. Where its face should have been was a blur, a smudge, like reality hadn't finished rendering that part. When it spoke, its voice came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing across the parking lot and inside Curtis's head simultaneously. Inspection required. Exit vehicle. Documentation required. Curtis shook his head, hands locked on the steering wheel. No. No, I'm leaving. I'm getting out of here. But even as he said it, he knew he couldn't. His engine wouldn't start, the other trucks had him boxed in, and that thing was opening his door, reaching for him with hands that had too many fingers. Curtis did the only thing he could think of. He reached into his glove box and pulled out the small Bible his grandmother had given him when he'd started driving, back when he was just a kid with a new CDL and big dreams. He hadn't opened it in years, hadn't thought about it in longer, but now he clutched it like a lifeline and began to read. He didn't even know what passages he was reading, just opened to a random page and started speaking the words aloud. The effect was immediate. The thing at his door recoiled, its blurred face contorting. The other truck's engine sputtered and died. The lights in the building flickered. Curtis kept reading, his voice growing stronger, and the way station began to change around him. The new paint peeled away, revealing the aged, weather-beaten structure he remembered. The fresh asphalt cracked and faded. The modern equipment rusted in seconds. The other trucks started to dissolve, fading from newest to oldest, their solid forms becoming translucent. Curtis could see through them now, could see the drivers still sitting in their cabs, trapped in those vehicles for years or decades, unable to leave, slowly merging with their rigs. They weren't moving anymore, weren't even really alive, just echoes of people who'd made the mistake of stopping at this place. Curtis kept reading, and the thing that had been pretending to be an officer backed away, losing cohesion, breaking apart into smoke or shadow or something else entirely. The yellow light from the building windows dimmed and went out, and most importantly, Curtis felt his engine catch. The Volvo roared to life, all systems normal, and the scale light ahead of him turned green. Curtis didn't hesitate. He put the truck in gear and drove, smashing through the circle of fading phantom trucks, bouncing off the scale platform and rocketing back onto the highway. He didn't look in his mirrors, didn't want to see what the way station looked like now, if it was still there at all or if it had vanished back into whatever dimension it normally inhabited. He drove for 2 hours straight before finally pulling into a rest area, hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the steering wheel. Other trucks were parked there, normal trucks with normal drivers who nodded at him as he walked past on his way to the bathroom. Real people, real vehicles, real world. Curtis splashed water on his face and looked at himself in the mirror, seeing the fear still etched in his features. The Bible was still in his hand, he realized. He looked down at it, this old book that had somehow saved him, and made a decision. From now on, it would ride on his dashboard, always visible, always accessible. Because Curtis Dalton had learned that there were places on the highway that weren't quite part of the normal world, stations and stops that existed in the cracks of reality, waiting to trap unwary drivers. He made his delivery to Los Angeles 12 hours late, took the penalties and the angry phone calls from his dispatcher. But Curtis didn't care about any of that. He was alive, he was free, and he hadn't become another ghost sitting in a truck at that way station, waiting for eternity in a parking lot that existed outside of time. When he finally made it home to Oregon 3 days later, Curtis looked up the location of that way station on I-15. According to official records, there was no way station at that mile marker. There never had been. The nearest one was 40 miles south, and it had been closed for renovations for the past 6 months. Curtis never drove through Nevada again if he could help it. And when other drivers talked about weird experiences on the road, stories they'd never tell their dispatchers or their families, Curtis listened carefully. Because he knew now that the highway had its own reality, its own rules and places where those rules broke down completely. The way station was one of those places, and somewhere out there it was still waiting, still looking new and fresh and normal, ready to trap the next driver who made the mistake of pulling in when that green sign commanded them to stop. Story 4. The Dead Zone. Richard Pemberton had been hauling tanker loads of gasoline and diesel fuel for 14 years, certified for hazmat and proud of his safety record. On November 9, 2021, he was driving a load of premium gasoline from a refinery in Texas to a distribution center in Oklahoma when he entered what the old-timers called a dead zone, and Richard learned why some stretches of highway earned that name. It was 3 in the morning, the highway empty and dark, when Richard's truck lost power. Not suddenly, not with any warning lights or alarms, but gradually, like something was draining the life from the vehicle. His speed dropped from 65 to 60 to 55, and no amount of pressure on the accelerator made any difference. The engine kept running, but it was like the truck was being held back by invisible hands. Richard checked his gauges, seeing normal readings everywhere. Fuel, oil pressure, coolant, everything looked fine. But his speed kept dropping, and now his headlights were dimming too, the bright halogen beams fading to a weak yellow glow that barely illuminated the road ahead. His dashboard lights flickered and the GPS screen went dark. "Come on, baby, don't do this to me," Richard muttered, flipping switches, checking connections, trying to figure out what was happening. A tanker full of gasoline wasn't something you wanted to break down with, especially not in the middle of nowhere at 3 a.m. He grabbed his CB radio, but it was dead, not even static coming through. His cell phone showed no signal. The truck slowed to a crawl, maybe 10 miles per hour, and Richard had no choice but to guide it onto the shoulder. The moment his tires left the pavement, the engine died completely. All his lights went out, plunging him into absolute darkness. Even the red glow of his dashboard display was gone. Richard sat there, hands on the steering wheel, listening to his own breathing and the sound of his heartbeat in his ears. Then he noticed the silence. It was too complete, too total. There were no insect sounds, no wind, no distant traffic. Nothing. It was like someone had put the world on mute, sucked all the sound out of the air. Richard reached for his flashlight, kept in the side pocket of his door, and flicked it on. The beam was weak, barely penetrating the darkness, but it was something. Richard climbed out of his cab, flashlight in hand, and immediately felt wrong. The air was thick, almost liquid, and when he moved, it was like pushing through water. Each step took effort, and the darkness seemed to press in around him, hungry and alive. His flashlight beam didn't travel far, maybe 5 feet, before being swallowed completely. He walked around his truck, checking connections and looking for obvious problems, but found nothing. The tanker was fine, no leaks, no damage. The truck looked normal, but nothing worked. It was like every electrical system had been completely drained, every battery emptied. Richard tried his door-mounted spotlight, his emergency flashers, even the simple courtesy lights inside his cab. Nothing. All dead. That's when Richard noticed the road. He aimed his flashlight at the pavement and saw that it was different. The asphalt was wrong, the color off, and when he knelt down to touch it, the surface felt organic somehow, slightly warm and disturbingly soft. Richard jerked his hand back, wiping it on his jeans, and stood up quickly. A sound cut through the silence. It was distant at first, barely audible, but growing louder. Richard recognized it as an engine, another vehicle approaching. Relief flooded through him. Help was coming, someone who could give him a jump start or at least call for assistance. He moved to the edge of the shoulder, waving his flashlight, ready to flag down the approaching vehicle. The headlights appeared in the distance, bright and normal, and Richard felt hope surge in his chest. But as the vehicle got closer, that hope turned to confusion. then fear. The headlights were wrong, too far apart, too high off the ground. And the sound of the engine was strange, a deep thrumming that Richard felt in his bones more than heard with his ears. The vehicle passed him, and in the brief moment of illumination, Richard saw that it wasn't a normal truck. It was huge, easily twice the size of his tanker, with a cab that looked more like a locomotive than anything made for highways. The trailer behind it was featureless and black, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. And there was no driver visible in the cab, just an empty seat and a steering wheel that turned on its own. The vehicle passed without slowing, its running lights creating patterns that hurt to look at, geometric shapes that seemed to exist in more dimensions than Richard's eyes could process. The sound of its engine faded, and Richard was left alone in the darkness again, his weak flashlight beam the only light in the world. More vehicles came after that. They arrived sporadically, sometimes minutes apart, sometimes several passing in quick succession. None of them were normal. Richard saw trucks with too many wheels, cars with windows that showed impossible landscapes inside, vans that seemed to stretch longer than they should as they passed. None of them stopped. None of them even slowed. They just drove through this dead zone, following the road to destinations Richard couldn't imagine. He tried flagging them down at first, waving his flashlight, shouting, but none responded. It was like he wasn't even there, like he existed in a different layer of reality that these vehicles passed right through. Richard began to wonder if he was the ghost, if he'd died somehow and just didn't know it yet. The thought terrified him more than the strange trucks did. Hours passed, though Richard's watch had stopped working, the hands frozen at 3:07 a.m. He stayed near his truck, afraid to wander too far into the darkness, afraid of what might be out there beyond the weak circle of his flashlight. The oppressive silence continued, broken only by the passage of those impossible vehicles. Richard noticed something else strange. He wasn't getting tired, wasn't getting hungry or thirsty. His body felt suspended somehow, like all his normal biological processes had been paused. He should have needed to use the bathroom by now, should have been yawning and fighting to keep his eyes open. But he felt exactly the same as when he'd first stopped. Time wasn't passing normally here, if it was passing at all. A vehicle approached that was different from the others. This one slowed down, pulling onto the shoulder ahead of Richard's truck. It looked almost normal, a standard semi from maybe the 90s, but there was something off about its proportions, like someone had built it from memory rather than blueprints. The driver's door opened, and a figure climbed down. Richard's first thought was relief. Another person, someone who could help, someone who could explain what was happening. But as the figure walked toward him, Richard's relief curdled into dread. The person moved wrong, their gait too smooth, like they were gliding rather than walking. And when they got close enough for Richard to see their face in his flashlight beam, he saw that it was blank. Not featureless, but shifting. Like their face couldn't decide what it wanted to be and was cycling through possibilities too fast to follow. "You shouldn't be here," the figure said, its voice oddly flat and emotionless. "This road isn't for the living." Richard took a step back, his heart pounding. "I broke down. My truck just died. I'm trying to get help." The figure tilted its head, studying him. "Nothing breaks down here. You were brought here. Something wanted you here." It gestured at the darkness around them. "This is a between place, a road that connects realities. The vehicles you see are in transit, moving from one world to another. You shouldn't be able to perceive them at all." "I want to leave," Richard said, his voice shaking. "I want to get back to the normal highway." The figure was silent for a long moment. "There's a price for leaving. The road wants something from you. It always does." It reached out with one hand, and Richard saw that its fingers were too long, the joints bending in too many places. Give me your name. Your real name. The one your mother whispered when you were born. Give me that, and I can send you back. Richard's mind reeled. His name? That seemed too simple, but also fundamentally wrong. Giving this thing his name felt like giving away something essential, something he'd never be able to get back. What happens if I refuse? Then you stay here. Eventually you'll become like me, like all of us who serve the road. You'll lose your face, your identity, and you'll help transition others who stumble into this place. It's not a bad existence. You stop feeling pain, stop feeling much of anything. Richard thought about his wife waiting for him at home. His 2 daughters, both in college now, but still his little girls. His life, imperfect and complicated and beautiful. He couldn't give that up, couldn't become a faceless servant of some cosmic highway. But giving up his name felt like dying anyway, like erasing himself from existence. There has to be another way, Richard said desperately. The figure seemed to consider this. There is one other option. You're carrying a full load of gasoline, yes? Highly flammable, highly volatile. You could rupture the tank, the fire might burn through the veil, create a gap you could escape through. But it would destroy you in the process. Your body would burn, though your consciousness might make it back. Richard stared at the figure, trying to determine if it was lying, if this was some kind of trick. But the blank face gave nothing away, just kept shifting through its endless possibilities. Richard looked at his tanker truck, at the 8,000 gallons of premium gasoline it carried. An explosion like that would be massive, would probably vaporize him instantly. But maybe, just maybe, it would work. Richard made his decision. He walked to his tanker, found the valve that would release the fuel, and opened it. Gasoline poured out onto the weird, organic pavement, the smell sharp and acrid. The figure watched him without comment, without trying to stop him. Richard grabbed road flares from his emergency kit, the old-fashioned kind that didn't need electricity to function. If I do this, if it works, I'm not coming back here ever, Richard said to the figure. This road doesn't get another chance at me. If you survive, if you make it back, you'll be marked, the figure replied. The road will always know where you are, but yes, it will leave you alone. You'll have earned that much. Richard struck the flare, its bright red flame shocking in the darkness. He looked at his truck one last time, thought about his family, and tossed the flare into the spreading pool of gasoline. The explosion was instantaneous and enormous. Richard felt the heat, felt his body coming apart, felt himself scatter into a million burning pieces. But his consciousness held together, a core of awareness that refused to dissolve. He felt himself being pushed, thrown violently through layers of reality, through the veil that separated the dead zone from the normal world. And then Richard Pemberton was lying on his back on normal highway pavement, staring up at a dawn sky. His truck was gone, completely gone, not even wreckage left behind. His clothes were intact, his body unmarked. Truck drivers were pulling over, running toward him, asking if he was okay, what had happened. Richard sat up slowly, patting himself down, hardly believing he was alive. I don't know, he told the concerned drivers. I don't remember anything. And that became his story, the one he told the police and his company and his insurance investigators. A complete blank. No memory of how his truck had vanished or how he'd ended up unconscious on the highway shoulder, 50 miles from where he'd last remembered being. But Richard remembered everything, really. He remembered the dead zone, the impossible vehicles, the faceless figure that had offered him a choice. And sometimes, late at night, he felt a tingling awareness, like something vast and hungry was watching him, keeping track of him. The road knew where he was, knew what he'd done to escape, but it kept its word and left him alone. Richard Pemberton never drove a truck again after that November night. He took a desk job, something safe and boring that kept him far from highways and far from the possibility of ever entering another dead zone. He knew he'd gotten lucky that very few people who stumbled into those between places ever found their way out. And he knew that somewhere out there on some dark stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere, the dead zone was still waiting, still pulling in drivers who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong moment, still collecting souls for whatever purpose that cosmic road served. The faceless servants were still there too, offering their terrible choices to the trapped and desperate. Richard hoped nobody else would be foolish enough or desperate enough to choose the path of fire like he had, but he suspected some would. The road was always hungry after all, and there were always more drivers willing to risk everything for one more mile. Story 5. The Hitchhiker. Daniel Kovac had a simple policy that had served him well through 21 years of long-haul trucking. Never pick up hitchhikers. Never, under any circumstances, no matter how pitiful they looked or how bad the weather was. On July 22, 2023, Daniel broke that rule and he paid a price that still haunts him today. It was late afternoon on Highway 50 in Nevada, that lonely stretch they call the loneliest road in America. And Daniel was running empty, heading back to Reno after dropping a load in Colorado. The desert stretched out on all sides, endless and hostile, the heat making the air shimmer in waves. Daniel had the AC cranked, his CB playing classic rock, and he was thinking about what he'd have for dinner when he got back to civilization. That's when he saw her. She was standing on the shoulder, thumb out, wearing what looked like a waitress uniform from a diner, the kind of pink dress with white trim that you don't see much anymore. She looked young, maybe early 20s, with long dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. Even from a distance, Daniel could see she was in distress, could see the desperation in her posture. Daniel's first instinct was to drive past, to follow his rule, but something made him slow down. Maybe it was the fact that he had a daughter about the same age, or maybe it was the sheer isolation of the location. Out here, if he didn't stop, nobody else might for hours. The girl could die of exposure before sunset. Against his better judgment, Daniel pulled onto the shoulder about 50 yards past her and stopped. In his side mirror, he watched her run toward his truck, and Daniel felt his first twinge of unease. She was running too fast, covering ground too quickly, and her smile as she approached was too wide, showing too many teeth. Daniel's hand moved toward the door lock, but before he could engage it, she was climbing up into his cab, sliding into the passenger seat with practiced ease. "Thank God," she said, her voice breathless and high-pitched. "I've been out here for hours. Nobody stops anymore, you know. Everybody's too scared, but you stopped. You're a good man." She turned to look at him, and Daniel saw that her eyes were wrong. The pupils were too large, consuming most of the iris, and they didn't quite focus on him properly. "Where you headed?" Daniel asked, his voice tight, already regretting this decision. "East," she said simply. "Just east, as far as you're going." She settled into the seat, buckling her seatbelt with a click that sounded too loud in the cab. "I'm Emma, by the way. Emma Wallace. Thanks for the ride." Daniel put the truck in gear, pulling back onto the highway, and tried to convince himself that everything was fine, that his instincts were wrong. "I'm Daniel. What were you doing all the way out here? Nearest town is 30 miles back." Emma's smile never wavered. "I work at a diner. Worked. Past tense now, I guess. Had a fight with my boyfriend, and he left me out here. Can you believe that? Left me in the middle of the desert." She laughed, and the sound made Daniel's skin crawl. It was too high, too artificial, like someone doing an impression of laughter rather than actually finding something funny. "That's rough," Daniel said, keeping his eyes on the road. "You want me to call the police? That's abandonment, probably abuse. They could help you." "No police," Emma said quickly, her voice turning sharp. No calls, just drive, Daniel, just take me east. Her hand reached out and touched his arm, and Daniel jerked away from the contact. Her fingers were cold, ice cold, despite the desert heat, and where she'd touched him, his skin tingled uncomfortably. Daniel wanted to stop, wanted to throw her out of his truck, but they were in the middle of nowhere, miles from anything. He'd have to wait until they reached a town, somewhere public, where he could safely get her out. He pressed down on the accelerator, trying to eat up the miles quickly. Emma started talking, and she didn't stop. She told Daniel about her life, her childhood in small-town Nevada, her dreams of moving to California, her relationship with her boyfriend. But the details were wrong, contradictory. She'd say she grew up in Carson City, then 2 minutes later mention growing up in Ely. She'd say her boyfriend was named Mike, then call him Jason, then Robert. It was like she was making it all up as she went along, constructing a personality from pieces that didn't quite fit together. And she kept staring at him. Daniel could feel her eyes on him constantly, could see her in his peripheral vision, head turned toward him, that too wide smile never fading. He tried to ignore her, tried to focus on driving, but her presence was overwhelming, filling the cab with a wrongness that made it hard to breathe. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of orange and red when Daniel noticed something that made his heart sink. The mile markers were going backward. They'd passed marker 73, then 72, then 71. But Daniel was driving east. The numbers should have been increasing, not decreasing. He checked his compass, saw that he was indeed heading east, but the mile markers insisted otherwise. "Something wrong, Daniel?" Emma asked, her voice sing-song. "The mile markers are wrong," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice steady. Emma leaned forward to look out the windshield, her ponytail swinging. "They look fine to me. You must be seeing things. Maybe you're tired. Have you been driving too long? Maybe you should rest." She reached out again, placing her cold hand on his shoulder. And this time Daniel couldn't pull away without swerving the truck. "I'm fine," he ground out through clenched teeth. "Don't touch me." Emma pulled her hand back, but she was laughing again, that horrible artificial sound. "You don't like me, do you, Daniel? I can tell. You regret picking me up. You wish you'd followed your rule. Your never pick up hitchhikers rule. But you broke it, and now I'm here, and you can't get rid of me." Daniel's blood ran cold. He'd never told her about his rule, had never mentioned it. "How did you know about that?" Emma's smile somehow grew even wider, her face distorting to accommodate it. "I know lots of things about you, Daniel Kovac. I know about your wife, Susan, and your daughter, Rebecca. I know about your house in Reno, the blue one with the white trim. I know about the dog you had when you were 10, the one that got hit by a car, and how you cried for a week. I know everything, Daniel, because I've been with you for a long, long time." Daniel's hands were shaking on the steering wheel. "What are you? What do you think I am?" Emma's voice had changed, becoming deeper, more resonant. "I'm the consequence, Daniel. I'm what happens when you break the rules of the road. Every driver has them, those superstitions and policies that keep them safe. Never pick up hitchhikers. Never stop in certain places, never drive on certain days, and when you break those rules, when you violate the agreements you've made with the highway, something comes to collect. That's me. I'm the collector." The truck cab was darkening as the sun fully set, and in the growing shadows Emma was changing. Her features were becoming less defined, her edges blurring, and Daniel could see through her now. Could see the seat back through her translucent form. She was fading, becoming something else, something that had never been human at all. "What do you want from me?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "A trade," Emma said, her voice now coming from everywhere, from the speakers and the vents and the dashboard itself. "You broke the rules, so you owe the road a debt. Pay it and I'll leave. Refuse and I'll stay with you forever, riding in your passenger seat, talking and talking and never stopping until you go mad from the sound of my voice. What kind of trade? Emma, or the thing pretending to be Emma, leaned close, and Daniel could smell decay. Could smell the desert sun and old asphalt and something worse underneath. There's another hitchhiker ahead 5 miles up the road, a man this time. He's real, actually human, and he's dangerous. Escaped from prison, killed 3 people. If you pick him up, he'll kill you too. But if you don't, if you drive past him, he'll flag down the next vehicle, a family in a minivan, and he'll kill all of them. 5 people, Daniel, 2 parents and 3 children. Daniel's mind reeled. You're lying. You're making this up to manipulate me. Am I? Emma's voice was amused. You'll see him in a few minutes, tall, wearing orange, standing right by the road. And you'll have to choose. Break your rule again and die, or keep your rule and let a family die. Either way, the road gets paid. Either way, someone suffers for your mistake. There has to be another option, Daniel said desperately. There isn't. You opened the door when you picked me up. You let me in, and now the debt has to be paid. Choose, Daniel. You don't have much time. The thing that had been Emma was almost completely transparent now, just a shimmer in the passenger seat, a suggestion of a form. And ahead in Daniel's headlights he could see a figure on the shoulder of the road, a man tall and broad-shouldered, wearing what did indeed look like orange prison clothing. The man raised his thumb, his face desperate. Daniel had seconds to decide. His foot hovered between the brake and the accelerator. Pick up the hitchhiker and die. Drive past and condemn a family. Those were his options, and time was running out. The man in orange was getting closer, his face becoming clearer in the headlights. Daniel made his choice. He pressed the brake, slowing down, and the thing in his passenger seat laughed with delight. Good choice, Daniel. The brave choice. The stupid choice. Say goodbye to your wife and daughter. You'll never see them again. But as Daniel's truck slowed, he did something the entity hadn't expected. He grabbed his CB radio and broadcast on the emergency channel. This is Daniel Kovacs driving eastbound on Highway 50, mile marker 65. There's an escaped prisoner on the roadside wearing orange, extremely dangerous. I'm picking him up to prevent him from attacking other vehicles. Send police immediately to this location. I'm going to keep him in my truck until help arrives. The entity in his passenger seat screeched, a sound like tearing metal. No, that's not how this works. You're supposed to die quietly. Daniel ignored it, pulling up next to the man in orange. But now that he was close, Daniel could see that the man looked wrong too. His proportions off, his movements too stiff. This wasn't a real escaped prisoner. It was another trap, another trick. You're all fake, Daniel said, understanding flooding through him. The whole thing is fake. There is no family, no escaped prisoner. It's all you trying to make me think I have to choose. But I don't. I don't have to play your game. The entity howled, and the man in orange dissolved like smoke. Emma's form solidified briefly, her face contorted in rage. You cheated. You were supposed to choose. I chose not to play, Daniel said firmly. I'm not picking up any more hitchhikers, real or fake. I'm not stopping. I'm driving to Reno, and you can either stay and keep screaming or you can get out. But you don't get what you want from me. For a moment, Daniel thought the entity would attack him, would do something terrible. But then Emma's form began to laugh, really laugh, with genuine amusement. Clever, she said, her voice returning to that artificial sweetness. Cleverer than most. Fine, Daniel Kovacs. You win this round. The debt is forgiven, but remember, the road never forgets. Break the rules again and I'll come back, or something worse will. And then she was gone, vanishing completely, leaving just empty air in the passenger seat. Daniel drove the rest of the way to Reno in stunned silence, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his heart gradually slowing from its frantic pace. When he finally pulled into his driveway at midnight, he sat in his truck for a long time just staring at his house, at the lit windows where his wife was probably waiting up for him. Daniel went inside, hugged Susan longer and harder than usual, and went to bed. But he didn't sleep. He kept thinking about Emma, about that ride through the desert, about how close he'd come to making a fatal mistake. The road had tested him and he'd passed, but it had been close, too close. Daniel Kovacs kept driving for 3 more years after that July night, but he never broke his rules again. Never picked up hitchhikers, never stopped in the wrong places, never took chances with the strange and inexplicable things that lived in the spaces between towns. And whenever he drove Highway 50 through Nevada, he watched his passenger seat carefully, making sure it stayed empty, making sure that Emma or something like her hadn't climbed back in when he wasn't looking. Because the road never forgot, and neither did Daniel. He'd learned that the rules existed for a reason, that the superstitions of drivers had been earned through hard experience, paid for by those who'd broken them and never returned. Daniel had gotten lucky. He'd outsmarted the thing in his truck, had refused to play its game. But he knew that luck like that didn't come twice. The next time, if there was a next time, he might not be clever enough. The hitchhiker might be more convincing. The trap might be better set. So Daniel drove carefully, followed his rules religiously, and never ever forgot the cold touch of Emma's hand on his arm, or the sound of her artificial laughter filling his cab, or the sight of her too wide smile in the darkness. Those memories kept him safe, kept him vigilant, and kept him alive on the roads where the normal and the impossible sometimes intersected, where a simple act of kindness could become a death sentence, and where the only thing standing between a driver and the hungry road was the willingness to follow the rules no matter how superstitious they seemed. Story 6. The Mirror Route. Jonathan Pierce had been driving dedicated routes for 16 years. Same pickup and delivery points, same roads, same schedule. On April 1st, 2022, Jonathan took what appeared to be his usual route and ended up somewhere that mirrored his journey in impossible ways, a reflection of reality that showed him things he was never meant to see. The day started normally. Jonathan picked up his load of auto parts from a warehouse in Detroit at 6 a.m., bound for a manufacturing plant in Cleveland. He'd made this exact run hundreds of times, knew every exit and rest stop, could drive it in his sleep. The weather was clear, traffic light, and Jonathan was making good time as he merged onto Interstate 90 eastbound. The first sign that something was wrong came when Jonathan noticed the trees. They lined the highway as they always did, but they were wrong somehow. The trees on the right side of the highway looked normal, but the ones on the left were inverted, growing upside down with their branches reaching into the ground and their roots spreading into the sky. Jonathan blinked, certain he was seeing things, but the inverted trees remained, swaying gently in a wind that made their root branches wave like twisted fingers. Jonathan grabbed his phone to take a picture, thinking nobody would believe this, but when he looked at the screen, the camera showed normal trees. He could see the inverted ones with his own eyes, but the phone's camera didn't register them at all. Jonathan felt unease crawling up his spine. He'd heard of visual distortions from fatigue, but he'd only been driving for an hour. He was wide awake, had slept well the night before. The highway itself began to change. The lanes started to multiply, spreading out until there were dozens of them, all running parallel. But traffic didn't increase. Jonathan's truck was still the only vehicle visible, alone on this impossibly wide highway. He checked his GPS and it showed him exactly where he should be on I-90 approaching the Pennsylvania border. But what he was seeing didn't match any map. Jonathan considered pulling over, but there was no shoulder anymore. The highway had become a smooth, unbroken surface that stretched to the horizons on both sides. He had no choice but to keep driving and hope this strange episode would pass. Maybe he was having some kind of medical event, a stroke or a seizure that was affecting his perception. But Jonathan felt fine physically, and his truck was responding normally to his controls. Then he saw the other trucks. They appeared in the lanes beside him, dozens of them, all identical to Jonathan's rig. Same model Peterbilt, same color, same trailer configuration. They were driving in perfect parallel with him, maintaining exact speed, and when Jonathan looked at the cabs, he saw himself driving them. Every single truck contained a version of Jonathan Pierce, all of them staring straight ahead, all of them gripping their steering wheels in identical poses. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't a medical event. This was something else, something impossible and terrifying. He tried waving at the nearest version of himself, but that Jonathan didn't react, just kept driving. Jonathan tried slowing down, and all the other trucks slowed with him. He sped up, and they matched his speed perfectly. They were all connected somehow, all moving as one. A sign appeared overhead, much too large, the letters stretching across multiple lanes. It read, "Welcome to the Mirror Route." Jonathan had never heard of any such place, but the sign was there, undeniable and real. More signs followed, giving directions to cities that didn't exist, places with names like Inversed City, Reflected Plains, and Parallel Junction. Jonathan tried his CB radio, and for once it worked, crackling to life with voices. But the voices were all his own, dozens of Jonathans all speaking at once, their words overlapping. "Where are we? What's happening? I'm scared. How do we get out?" All the questions Jonathan wanted to ask being asked by his parallel selves, none of them getting answers. The highway began to curve, and as it did, Jonathan realized he could see not just beside him, but through the other lanes, through the other trucks, into other versions of the route. He could see himself taking different exits, making different choices, each one branching off into its own parallel reality. One Jonathan pulled off at a rest area that didn't exist on the real I-90. Another Jonathan crashed, his truck spinning out on invisible ice. A third Jonathan kept driving straight as the highway curved, flying off into a void. "This is showing me possibilities," Jonathan whispered, understanding flooding through him. Alternative versions of this drive, different timelines. But why? What was the purpose of this? Was it a warning, a lesson, or just some cosmic accident that had pulled him into this impossible space? The trucks around him started to diverge, each one taking slightly different paths, and Jonathan watched as his parallel selves made their various choices. Some seemed to make it through safely, their trucks fading into the distance. Others met terrible ends, crashes and explosions and disappearances. Jonathan realized he was watching probability itself, seeing all the potential outcomes of his journey. But which timeline was he in? Which Jonathan was the real one? Or were they all equally real, all equally valid versions of the same person making the same drive? Jonathan's head throbbed as he tried to process this, tried to make sense of a reality that had suddenly become infinite and overwhelming. One of the parallel Jonathans turned to look at him, making direct eye contact across the impossible distance between lanes. That Jonathan's face was twisted in terror, and he was mouthing words that Jonathan could somehow understand despite the distance and the barriers between them. "Don't trust the exit." The truck containing that terrified Jonathan suddenly swerved, smashing into an invisible barrier, and exploded in a ball of flame that spread across multiple lanes. Jonathan felt the heat from that explosion, felt the shock wave rock his truck, even though the burning vehicle was many lanes away. The fire spread, consuming other versions of himself, their trucks bursting into flames one by one. Jonathan could hear his own screams echoing across the mirror route, dozens of his voices crying out in pain and fear. "I need to get out," Jonathan said aloud, his voice shaking. "I need to get back to the real highway." But how? Every exit he could see looked suspicious now, especially after that warning. Don't trust the exit. Which exit? All of them? One specific one? The highway started to twist, literally twist like a ribbon, and Jonathan felt his stomach lurch as his truck followed the contours of the impossible road. He was driving on the side of the highway now, then upside down, gravity working in ways that didn't make sense. His cargo shifted in the trailer, metal scraping against metal, but the load stayed secure through some physics that had nothing to do with tie-downs and everything to do with whatever force controlled this place. More signs appeared. Exit approaching. Choose wisely. Only one leads home. Jonathan saw the exits ahead, dozens of them, all looking identical. Each one showed a ramp leading off into white light, promising escape. But one of the parallel Jonathans had warned him not to trust the exits. Maybe they weren't escapes at all. Maybe they were traps. Jonathan made a split-second decision. Instead of taking any of the marked exits, he cranked his steering wheel hard to the left, breaking through the lanes, driving perpendicular to the flow of traffic. His truck punched through invisible barriers, and Jonathan felt reality tearing around him like wet paper. The other trucks, the parallel versions of himself, all turned to watch him, their faces pressing against their windows, their expressions mixing hope and horror. The highway fought him, tried to pull him back, but Jonathan kept driving, aiming for the darkness beyond the lit lanes. If the exits couldn't be trusted, and staying on the mirror route meant becoming one of these trapped parallel versions forever, then his only option was to break out entirely, to refuse the offered choices and make his own. Jonathan's truck burst through one final barrier and everything went white. He felt himself falling, felt his truck tumbling through space, felt all his parallel selves crying out in unison. Then impact, hard and jarring, and Jonathan's truck was on normal highway again, tires squealing as he fought to control it. He was on I-90, exactly where he should be, and the highway looked completely normal. The trees were right side up. There was only one lane in his direction with normal traffic around him. Other drivers were honking at him, swerving to avoid his erratically moving truck. Jonathan got control, pulled onto the shoulder, and sat there shaking for a long time. His GPS showed he'd lost 40 minutes somehow. According to his clock, he'd been on the mirror route for less than 10 minutes, but the rest of the world had moved on without him. Jonathan checked. His trailer found everything secure and undamaged. He checked himself in his mirror, seeing only one face, his own, looking pale and terrified. Jonathan made his delivery to Cleveland 2 hours late, took the penalties, and never mentioned why. What could he say that would make sense? That he'd driven through a place where all possible versions of his route existed simultaneously? That he'd watched himself die dozens of times? That he'd broken through reality itself to escape? He kept driving, because that's what drivers do, but Jonathan Pierce never took I-90 through that particular stretch again. He added hundreds of miles to his routes, went way out of his way to avoid it. And sometimes, late at night when he was alone on empty highways, Jonathan would see them in his mirrors. His parallel selves, still trapped on the mirror route, still driving their eternal journey, still trying to find the right exit that would lead them home. Jonathan had escaped, but he'd left countless versions of himself behind. They were still there, still experiencing every possible variation of that April 1st drive, still dying and crashing and disappearing in infinite loops of probability. And the worst part was knowing that in some parallel timeline, another Jonathan was sitting in a truck just like his, having just escaped the mirror route, looking in his mirrors and seeing the trapped versions of himself that he'd abandoned. Maybe he was one of those trapped versions Jonathan sometimes thought in his darkest moments. Maybe he'd never really escaped. Maybe this normal-seeming reality was just another branch of the mirror route, and somewhere out there a different Jonathan was living the real life while he existed in this reflection. There was no way to know for certain, no way to prove he was the original rather than a copy. So Jonathan drove carefully, followed the rules, and tried not to think too hard about the nature of reality or the possibility that every choice created new branches, new versions, new parallel selves living out their different fates. He'd seen behind the curtain, seen how thin the barriers between timelines really were. And once you knew that, once you understood that every moment contained infinite possibilities and that you were just one version of yourself among countless others, you couldn't ever feel quite real again. The mirror route had shown Jonathan the truth about existence, and it was a truth that left him feeling hollow and uncertain, never quite sure if the road beneath his tires was solid or just another reflection waiting to shatter. Story 7. The Last Delivery. Vincent Reyes had spent 18 years hauling freight across America, and in all that time he'd never missed a delivery or failed to complete a run. On December 13th, 2021, Vincent accepted what appeared to be a simple overnight delivery to an address in rural Montana, and he learned that some packages should never reach their destinations, and some addresses exist in places the living were never meant to go. The dispatch call came at 8 p.m., unusual timing but not unheard of. A rush delivery, premium pay, pickup in Billings and delivery to a location about 90 miles north. The cargo was light, just a few crates marked fragile and handled with care, with a delivery address that was nothing but a rural route number and GPS coordinates. Vincent took the job, loaded the crates into his box truck and headed out into the Montana winter night. The snow started almost immediately, thick flakes that reduced visibility and made the roads treacherous. Vincent didn't mind. He'd driven in worse and his truck handled well in winter conditions. The GPS guided him north on Highway 87, then onto smaller state routes, then onto county roads that weren't well maintained. The address was definitely out in the middle of nowhere, which wasn't unusual for rural Montana. Lots of ranches and properties miles from anything resembling civilization. But as Vincent drove deeper into the countryside, following the increasingly small and dark roads, he noticed something wrong. There were no lights anywhere. No house lights, no yard lights, no distant glow of towns or cities. Just absolute darkness beyond his headlights, and the snow falling through his beams in hypnotic patterns. Vincent checked his GPS, which insisted he was on the right path, following the coordinates exactly. The road became dirt, then gravel, then barely more than 2 ruts through snow-covered fields. Vincent's truck bounced over frozen ground, and he started to seriously doubt whether this delivery was legitimate. Who would have a rush delivery to a place this remote? But the money was already in his account, the advance payment transferred before he'd even picked up the cargo. If someone wanted to pay premium rates to get something delivered to the middle of nowhere, that was their business. Vincent's headlights caught a structure ahead, and he felt relief. Finally, the destination. But as he got closer, his relief turned to confusion. The building was a church, old and weathered, standing alone in the empty field. No other structures nearby, no houses or barns or any signs of habitation. Just this solitary church, its white paint peeling, its steeple crooked, its windows dark. The GPS announced, "You have arrived at your destination." Vincent checked the coordinates again, checked the delivery address. This was definitely the place. The crates were to be delivered to this church in the middle of nowhere at 11:30 p.m. on a snowy December night. Vincent sat in his truck for a moment, wondering if this was some kind of joke or test. But a job was a job, and Vincent prided himself on never failing to complete a delivery. He climbed out of his truck, pulled his jacket tight against the cold, and walked around to the back to open his cargo doors. The crates were there, 4 of them, each about 3 feet on a side, sealed and locked. Vincent had no idea what they contained, and he hadn't asked. Part of being a professional driver was not being too curious about cargo. He loaded the first crate onto his dolly and wheeled it toward the church entrance. The front door was unlocked, swinging open when Vincent pushed it, revealing a dark interior. Vincent switched on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the blackness, illuminating rows of pews and an altar at the far end. Everything looked old and abandoned, dust thick on every surface, cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. "Hello?" Vincent called out. "Delivery for this address. Anyone here?" His voice echoed in the empty space, but no one answered. Vincent wheeled the crate up the center aisle, his flashlight beam bouncing with each step. He reached the altar and looked around, trying to figure out where he was supposed to leave these crates. There were no instructions, no signs, nothing indicating what he should do. Then Vincent noticed the doors behind the altar, small and recessed into the wall. Curiosity got the better of him, and he opened one. It led down, a stone stairway descending into darkness beneath the church. Cool air flowed up from below, carrying a smell that made Vincent's nose wrinkle. It was organic and wrong, like decay mixed with something chemical. Vincent's instincts screamed at him to leave, to abandon the delivery and drive away, but he'd never left a job unfinished. He wheeled the dolly with its crate to the top of the stairs and carefully began descending, one step at a time, his flashlight showing the way. The stairs went down much farther than they should have, far deeper than any church basement should extend. Vincent counted steps, past 30, then 40, then 50. How deep was this going? Finally, the stairs ended in a large chamber, and Vincent's flashlight beam couldn't reach the walls or ceiling. The space was enormous, far larger than the church above it. The smell was stronger here, and Vincent could hear something now. A low, rhythmic sound like breathing or heartbeat, or both combined. His hands were shaking as he aimed his flashlight around, trying to see what was in here with him. The beam caught something at the edge of its range, and Vincent felt his blood run cold. There were people here, dozens of them, standing in perfect circles, all facing inward toward the center of the chamber. They weren't moving, weren't breathing, just standing in absolute stillness. Vincent moved his flashlight from face to face, seeing expressions that were blank and empty, eyes that didn't blink, mouths that hung slightly open. "Hello?" Vincent's voice cracked. "I have a delivery. Where should I put these crates?" None of the figures responded. None of them even seemed to register his presence. Vincent edged closer to the nearest circle of people, and as his flashlight illuminated them, more clearly he realized they weren't standing on the floor. They were standing slightly above it, hovering inches off the ground, suspended by nothing visible. Vincent backed away, bumping into his dolly, the metallic clang echoing through the